All right, folks, welcome and thank you for joining today's Google Talk with Matt Dixon. Before we get started, I would like to ask everybody in the room to mute their phones and turn off any notifications, as this is being recorded live, so we don't want any interruptions. As well, I just want to announce we are expecting a lot of people to join through live stream, so if you do have questions for Matt, we have a 10-minute section at the end where you'll be able to ask those questions. And I've set up a dory for people remotely, and it's at go/Coach Dixon, where you can submit your questions. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. For those of you who don't know Matt, Matt is a world-class triathlon coach. He's also a former triathlon pro, and today, he's most well known for creating Purple Patch Fitness, which is a global community headquartered here in San Francisco. As part of Purple Patch, he manages, I say manages, but coaches a handful of elite pro triathletes, just to name a few, which you might know: Jesse Thomas, Sarah Piampiano, Sam Appleton, Laura Siddall. Laura Siddall actually went on to win Ironman New Zealand this past weekend, so congrats, Matt. As well as that, he coaches a wide variety of age group athletes, so amateurs like you and me, ranging from the very elite. He's helped over 250 age group athletes qualify for the Ironman World Championships in Kona, to the more average athletes who are just seeking to stay fit or conquer one of their life goals. And it's here where Matt has really specialized his focus on these athletes who are time-starved, like you and me, trying to fit in training in our busy lives of work, family, etc. Now, Matt's a busy man as well. He does all that, and he's also written 2 books. He wrote The Well-Built Triathlete, and most recently launched the Fast Track Triathlete, of which you have a copy here on your chairs. Now, you might be asking, who am I? My name is Derk Korver. I'm a fellow Googler and also a triathlete, and I'm part of Purple Patch Fitness, and I train with Matt. So yeah, let's get started. I'll give the floor to Matt here. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you created Purple Patch Fitness.
Sure. I am the epitome of an example of how to do a professional triathlon career very, very poorly. As you can tell, I'm not from the States. I actually came across here in 1992, and I was one of the sort of lucky, relatively early sort of guys that came across on a swimming scholarship. So my backbone or my background was swimming, and swimming is a sport that is, at least at that time, was all about high volume, high endurance. And I remember when we swam, we weren't even allowed water bottles on the pool deck, and even though we were swimming 27 hours a week of swimming a week. So it gives you some idea of sort of the mindset back then in the early 90s. In parallel to swimming, I was studying exercise physiology. So right from the start, I had this interesting blend between sort of science and, of course, being an elite athlete. And when I finished my swimming career, which ended up not making the Olympic team, the quest of most internationals that were coming over here were trying to make our national teams. I didn't make it. I was 5th or 6th. It shows you how long ago it was. I can't even remember whether it was 5th or 6th. But that's where I got into coaching, and I started as a swimming coach. And I was very lucky to actually start with a very, very good age group program. But I realized I didn't want to be a swimming coach, or at least just in the regular setting. So I went on to do my master's degree in clinical physiology. And so now I had this advanced degree in clinical physiology. I went on to coach at the Division 1 level while I was doing that. And that's where I found triathlon. And I found that I was pretty good at triathlon. And so out of that, despite my background of having a backbone in, or a background in elite swimming, having a coaching background already with several years of coaching and a master's degree in clinical physiology, I went on to be the great example of how to do a professional career poorly. And I took the work ethic at swimming and thought, well, if I was training 27 hours a week for a 2 to 4 minute event, what am I going to have to train for an Ironman? And so I multiplied it as much as you possibly could with continued little, nothing but lip service to subjects such as recovery, nutrition, fueling, hydration, and had this sort of small rise, maybe a little bit of glory, and then a staggering defeat into chronic fatigue. And interestingly, that was a wonderful thing that I think happened for me, was the fact that everything came to a shut. And about 15 years ago now, my professional triathlon career was over, and I was starting to coach triathletes, and that was really the start of Purple Patch. It was bizarrely a positive thing.
So you did a professional career poorly. How can that be a positive thing?
It was, I think it was one of those situations in my life that it forced me to take a step back. And I think so often we charge ahead and we forge ahead with our quest, especially when it is, as an athlete, it's a very specific quest, world-class performance. And so you can filter out so much of the things that are right in front of you. And when it's stripped away, as with any sort of adversity that can happen in life, it forced me to take a step back and look at the landscape of my sport at the time, which was triathlon. And what I saw was, at the elite level, and particularly at the amateur level, I just saw so much underperformance or low return on investment relative to the effort that people were putting in. And the barometer of success at the time was simply about the accumulation of hours. More miles, more hours, the better it is. And subjects, which now are quite trendy, but recovery, nutrition, fueling, everything was an afterthought. And I just thought there must be a better way of approaching the sport globally. And I looked at the symptom of underperformance, and what I saw at all levels, from people that were beginning to get into the sport with big lives, as well as at the top world-class level, most athletes were showing up. Motivation wasn't the challenge, but they were showing up to their races fit and fatigued. And I thought, that can't be good for ultimate performance. And so, with my education background and my own personal experience and what I saw in my coaching, I think it was really the birth of the Purple Patch methodology, because I decided at that time to be a bit counterculture against the overall sort of general theme of how people would go about endurance sports globally. And I decided to make a pretty bold move and say, I'm going to go about it from a very different lens. And that was really, I think, for me, the start of the Purple Patch methodology, which 15 years later is still the heartbeat of what we do. And
wow.
So I must have been onto something, at least. But yeah.
So that must have been quite a shock to the triathlon community, a new way of thinking. How would you define the Purple Patch methodology?
It was a shock. I was, in fact, I got labelled the recovery coach because I bubbled that right up to the top of the conversation. A lot of my writing was around recovery, and it wasn't always a positive name that I was given, although now it's sort of become a badge of honour in many ways. And so I think the methodology can really be defined in very simple terms. And as it lives now today, there is a common thread. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a world-class athlete or someone that's purely a fitness enthusiast. Everyone wants to improve. Everyone wants to thrive. That's the common thread that I see amongst fitness enthusiasts to my professional athletes. And what we have found is that by integrating 4 key components, what we call the 4 pillars, and there are more, but these are the central 4 that I think are always omnipresent, and that's endurance activity, or training if you're a world-class athlete, but endurance activity supported with some strength and conditioning, so you have to have both, and with adequate recovery, and that encompasses sleep, which is a big trendy topic at the moment, with a backbone of really basic but important nutritional habits. When we get those 4 things present, people thrive, people accelerate. And it's completely regardless of level. It doesn't matter what level. Those 4 key components are the basics. Now, what we see a lot is people that are pretty good at being singularly focused. I really want to exercise. But it all falls to pieces if we don't have all 4 elements actually present in people's sort of emotional approach to life in many ways. And so I think that's the real backbone and the very central sort of thesis on everyone that we serve in many ways.
And by everyone, you mean you've mentioned the pros and as well as elites, and I've experienced that with training with you. You know, during our swim sets, the pros are to the left, and then we have all the time-starved athletes sort of in the rest of the lanes. How is it different working with these two types of athletes? It is different. It's a little bit Jekyll and Hyde in some ways, but at the same time, it really comes down to how you apply those principles. So if you can buy in for a moment that there are 4 basic tenets that we're going to be talking about: endurance, strength, nutrition as a big bucket, and recovery. It's really how you apply those principles. So let's first establish the mindset of the professional athlete. Their quest is unapologetically world-class performance. So what that means for the athlete, and that's who you read about in magazines if you're a triathlete, whatever it might be, but their quest is everything around physical performance is the centerpiece of their life. So my job as a coach is to actually take the other components of life and suppress them, okay? It's kind of like a monk's life, because they are, for a short period in their life, for 8, 10 years, they are seeking world-class performance. And so components like, obviously, the training, but nutrition, body work, massage, etc., their fueling, their sleep, that is their job. And everything else around life has to be built around that. That makes sense? So that's what the quest is. Unfortunately, many amateurs apply that to their lives, and that's when failing comes in. For the time-starved amateur, most time-starved amateurs that we work with, fitness enthusiasts back all the way up to Derk's level, who's an elite amateur, the mission, I believe, should be about integration. So it's not about seeking world-class performance. You're actually seeking more than that. I believe that what you're seeking is integrating very basic habits and an appropriate training program so that, yes, you can improve and get fitter, stronger, more powerful, or for him, get ready for the Hawaii Ironman, but not at the expense of the other institutions of your life. And in fact, when we think about working with an amateur, we're trying to do 2 things: help you thrive in sport, but also help you improve your health, help you improve how you can perform at the workplace and be the best version of yourself that you can for your family, friends, and everything else. And by successfully doing that, that defines the mindset, I would say, of what we're looking for. So it's really about the application of how we're sort of applying the foundational methodology in many ways. Yeah. And so a question here, when I'm looking at the group and just knowing the culture at Google, a lot of the employees here are performance driven and, to say the least, very time starved, I think, as well. What do you see people like us, what are the biggest mistakes you see us make?
I think it's 2. I think it's 2 things. The first is for the training athlete. So someone that would identify themselves as saying, you know what, I love to run marathons, or I like to do triathlons. And for that type of person, where they identify themselves as an amateur athlete, the biggest mistake is, as I mentioned at the top, thinking that success in your training program is actually being able to achieve a fixed number of training hours per week. So your barometer of success is the accumulation of time or miles. That's the first thing, because that ends up leading, that doesn't mesh. We always talk about life not being a spreadsheet. And so life is dynamic, it's dirty, it's vibrant. And so when you've got this living, breathing thing and you're trying to apply a fixed number of training hours every single week, bad decisions start to come into play, where you're compromising components like health, recovery, and overall hormonal success. So the first for the athletic-minded is that. For the fitness enthusiast, so the person that understands that exercise is important and wants to be healthy and wants to thrive and have it as a part of their life, the challenge, or I think the biggest mistake, is to be too singularly focused on one element that we're talking about. So you might have someone that says, I really want to improve body composition, so I'm going to eat really clean and I'm going to eat really healthy, and that's great, but if it's not supported with some strength and with some endurance, or if your sleep is terrible, you're not going to improve your body composition. Or you have someone, sort of the classic, that loves to exercise, but everything else is terrible, but you're not going to yield any performance gains when you go from that.
Right. Do you have any like live examples you could give?
On the spot, thank you, Derk. Sure. I'll give you a great example. Someone that I started working with a few months ago. The classic person that I tend to work with, time-starved executive that wants to integrate exercise into his life, and he understands, emotionally understands that performance in the workplace is going to be helped if he can exercise consistently. So he made that commitment. I am going to work out 5 days a week, period. But when we actually looked at what he was doing with his habits, he was making sure he was getting up every morning, typically at 5 a.m., working out for 60 to 75 minutes, but then it was straight to work. And the habits that he'd created is as soon as he finished his session, whether it was strength or whether it was endurance, he would shower, straight to work, not have breakfast. As he said, I buy a breakfast sandwich on the way to the work and it's sitting on the desk at the end of the day. And then he would go through his work day. And so he was implementing a single focus, positive exercise, but by underfueling following, he was setting off catastrophic events that were going to disrupt carrying stress hormones into the day. So when you exercise appropriately, you have cortisol to help you perform in the exercise. But if you don't fuel following, you're not going to naturally suppress cortisol, so you're carrying those elevated cortisol levels into your work day. So that disrupts energy balance. You're also going to set off something, what I like to call athletic starvation. So what that is your body is in deficit. You don't replace the deficit because you're not fueling following. And so therefore later in the day, you have really big challenges around portion control and the types of food that you're getting cravings for. So my executive, I'll call him Johnny because his name was Johnny, but he shall remain nameless, I think. But as he got to the later day, of course, he got to lunch, and what did he crave? Pasta, pizza, cookies, ice cream, because his body was crawling out for it as a protective mechanism. And then he can't control his cravings. He's in a slump. He eats them. What happens in the afternoon? He's really sleepy. So there's this massive stress symptom going on. There's an inability to eat properly. There's energy fluctuations in the day. And guess what? He was retaining body fat because when he eats that pasta in the middle of the day, that's been stored as fat. So it's one singular example of not joining the dots. He did something positive, but without a very basic habit, everything was falling to pot. So,
yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that example. I'm not Johnny though. So, okay, I think we all understand that and probably have experienced it as well. So, what are the biggest challenges to manage that, in your opinion?
I think that for busy people like you guys, it's an understanding of what to focus on. And so how do I take first steps? And what I mean by that is, in the world we live in now, we're not short of information. We have so much information coming us from all angles of even if you think about the 4 subjects that we talked about, endurance, strength, nutrition, and recovery, how much information out is there about all of these? And yet, all of those individual subjects, and we make it up to one recipe, is really prone to life hacking and quick fixes and quackery and stuff that is really, really confusing. So most people don't lack motivation if they sort of have a performance mindset, but the challenge is that they don't know what to focus on. That's the first real challenge that most people face. So how do we overcome the challenge of where to focus? And the interesting thing is the actual result is really basic. So conceptually, it's relatively appealing, but the actual habits that you want to integrate are actually really basic. But then you have to acknowledge as well that the second challenge is, great, I have a plan, I understand, and now life happens. And the management of decision making, of when to push through when you're tired, when to scale back, when to backdrop. How do we do it when life gets in the way and we have to manage with travel and components of that? That's where it becomes really challenging. So I'd say the 2 main challenges that we face are what to focus on, so filtering information, and then how to actually manage it in real life. And I find as a coach, education is important to empower the athlete, but a part of my role, a critical part of my role, from pros all the way down to people that would never compete in any sort of structured event, is becoming a filter of that information, because there's so much crap out there, let's face it. And so if you can create a filter, and then it becomes actually quite simple. That's the good news out of all of this, is that you can actually get to pretty simple solutions that are long-term, I would say, overall.
Right, so basically what you're saying there is, in these scenarios, when battling with these challenges, you're pushing athletes, or even if we're not athletes, to adopt an athletic mindset.
Yeah.
I've heard you say that quite often.
Yeah.
So how would you
What is the athletic
Yeah.
mindset? Yeah, it's, I think that we talk a lot about the athletic mindset, and what it is not about is trying to turn everyone into an athlete. That's not what we're actually trying to do. An athletic mindset is actually drawing off of the lessons that we have from our living laboratory, which are professional athletes, where we can look at how training methodology affects them, how great supporting habits actually helps them thrive, and then applying it to everyday people that are high performers. But adopting an athletic mindset doesn't mean that you're trying to become an athlete, because most of you guys in here, if not all of you guys, are not elite athletes and probably don't have aspirations to be an elite athlete, but you are an elite performer. At least you should be an elite performer, because I believe that your quest, hopefully your quest, is that you want to integrate a healthy lifestyle so that you can feel good and be the best version of yourself for as many years as we have on this place. But in addition to that, you are an elite performer in here, in Google, and you have a responsibility to be able to perform at your best in the workplace, and then leave this workplace and perform the best that you can for your family, friends, and everything else. And so we are not trying to turn people into athletes. What we're trying to have them do is adopt an athletic mindset so that they can thrive across their institutions. And those major institutions is, yes, improve in sport, whatever your endeavor is, and it might just be going to the bay club and doing exercise, but also in your health, in your ability to perform in the workplace, and of course outside of life with family and friends. And we know, it comes back, we know that it has to be a holistic lens where we draw on the lessons of the pros to actually facilitate success. And that's really the basic tenet of everything that we do in many ways.
And building on that, what are like some of the results that you aim for people adopting an athletic mindset?
I'm going to come to a word that's going to sound quite bizarre. I'm going to talk about control. And before I talk about control, I think it's important to understand, earlier I mentioned life hacks. There is no sugarcoating this. When we sort of talk about if without being obsessive, if you do want to thrive, there is no shortcut to success. There is an ongoing journey that you have to embrace. And so that's why I never talk about quick results. I don't talk about going on diets and all those things, because all of that reeks of short term. So it's mostly based in habit driven. And when we see people integrate positive habits, a few things occur. And those habits, again, are around endurance, strength, recovery, and nutrition. But when they integrate that over the long term, they always improve. But what ends up happening about just what is improvement is, I think that you start to establish an element of control. And what I mean by control is you start to establish, yes, you've got performance improvements in your sport, whatever your sport might be. So you get fitter, stronger, faster, and that's almost a great byproduct. But the really positive things is control over your energy management in the day. So if you can start to have predictable energy throughout the course of the workday, that's a great element. You start to have control over your body composition. So actually coming to a better place of homeostasis or health around body composition. And then some of the, I would say almost secondary, but in a work performance environment that's really critical, is this word resilience or robustness. People become more physically robust or resilient to stressors. And so when they do go through a lack of sleep with time zone travel, or they have to be up late for a presentation and they're getting compromised sleep, whatever it might be, there is a physical resilience that still enables them to perform in the short term. And then added to that is emotional resilience. So people become better equipped at being able to manage stressful situations because of these habits. And there is a direct link, proven by much research, to show that this state of well-being equips you for that. So it's pretty easy to think about, okay, if I've got management over my energy and I'm more robust and able to deal with adversity and different physical and emotional stresses, that's going to equip you to ultimately, yeah, I'm getting faster at whatever my endeavor is in a sporting sense, but I'm just a better performer in life. And the final effect is happiness. And when someone actually really adopts this mindset, whether it's guided by myself, Purple Patch, or not, I've yet to see someone that hasn't actually reported improved happiness, because we are all happier if we are under control of our life. And that's really the ultimate sense that we're looking for and the outcome that we're really looking for. So it doesn't, you know, as a triathlon coach, the leap that people make is that when I'm helping the majority of our Purple Patch athletes, which are time-starved amateurs, it's just about how fast you can go or can you qualify to Hawaii. And those goals are great, but the real results that you're looking for is to set people free and empowered to actually have management over the other institutions in life. Mm-hmm. If you can do that, the recipe is right, and the sporting side's easy. That's there. So, you know, don't be overly impressed that you got fourth in Hawaii last year, Derk. That was the easy part. It's the...
Thank you for that. No, I definitely hear you on all those points there. I also really noticed how the reward of working for something really hard, how that carries over into life and work. And I've learned the hard way as well, and maybe the most costly way, that there's no shortcuts to speed in triathlon. It's just really expensive if you want to get faster. Got to buy all the Dura Ace components and whatnot. But let's get a little practical here. I know that we don't have time to outline a full plan for everybody here. But what are some of the key need-to-knows when creating a plan for yourself and approaching training?
I mean, luckily there is a plan in the book, so you guys can enjoy that. But so it's a tough question. I knew you'd ask me this question, and in many ways it depends on what our goals are. So do we have Derk, who's trying to go to the Hawaii Ironman again and qualify and get on the podium, etc., or someone just trying to integrate exercise into their life? But there are some common themes that I can touch on. The most important thing is, whatever your recipe is, your training plan is, it has to have this magic word, sustainability. It has to be sustainable. And another way of saying that from an exercise standpoint is habitual. It has to become something that you do. So if your endurance activity or your training is like a monkey on the back, it's not sustainable, and you will fall into that trap of being fit and fatigued. When we think about performance in an athletic sense, the first word that we come up with is consistency. And so that's the first element we do. So as I talked about earlier, what most people do, athletes that are building their own plans or receiving plans from coaches, unfortunately, is to say, great, I want to exercise, or I want to go and do a marathon, I want to go and do a half Ironman. How many hours a week do I have to train? And the coach loyally writes them a training program, and they say, this is it. It's 15 hours a week of training to get ready for a half Ironman. And then what they do is they say, great, how am I going to fit this into my life? And they look at their life and they think, I don't have that many hours, but they do their darndest to cram it in by hook or crook. So what happens there? They compromise sleep, they compromise basic habits, and the sport becomes a monkey on their back. Their partner starts to detest the sport, and there's lots of tension, and they become rightly labeled as the obsessive triathlete. Well, that's the antithesis of what you want to do. So instead, I think you want to start at the other side of the equation. And we have athletes always go through this, and I should have a better name for it, but it's always, sometimes, rarely, projects where we're looking to actually get a true understanding of the landscape of your life. How many hours a week do you genuinely have? So when can you always exercise? When can you sometimes exercise? And when can you rarely? If life ebbs a little bit, you might have places to add in there. That's the first thing that you go through. And then you start to get an understanding of how many hours you have. But we have to also plug in time for yourself, time for your family, if you've got husband, wife, kids, etc. Time for sleep, because that's a non-negotiable, so you have to plug in your sleep, and some social life, because we would like you to be social. Now you have X number of hours a week, and it's typically less hours, but they're realistic hours than you may have thought that you had. But then the game becomes, how do I maximize those hours? And just by starting with that very basic approach, you can then calendar those hours into your work schedule, no different than a meeting, and you're set up for success. Part two to it then is you have to deploy a dynamic mindset. What I mean by a dynamic mindset is, if that is your best laid plans, as I mentioned before, life doesn't act like that. It's not a spreadsheet. So the next thing you have to do is you have to create a tier of specificity. And we always have, no matter whether it's fitness enthusiasts or Derk elite amateur triathlete or one of my pros, we have key sessions, which are typically the more intense, the more challenging, and the ones that are delivering the specificity. And then we have supporting sessions. And those are the ones that are nice to add in, great if you have time, but are the first to be scaled or removed if life gets in the way. And what that creates then is a starting of a management system. Because if you're traveling to New York, if you're based in San Francisco, and you can move sessions around and hang on to your key sessions, but you might lose or reduce some of the supporting sessions without guilt because it's appropriate. On the flip side, family goes away, I have Friday off work, you can now add on some extra sessions because life has ebbed and you've got more capacity. And now you've got this very basic sort of synchronized mindset of training with a prioritization. And that becomes incredibly powerful for athletes and fitness enthusiasts to ultimately create what I would call a recipe for success in many ways.
Yeah. For a moment there, I thought you were telling my life story. I've definitely gone through that phase where triathlon took over my life, and friends and family definitely let me know that was happening, and yeah, you do need to sort of try and fit it in. So I'm happy to say I have a good balance now, I think. But so to get the most bang for your buck, are you saying interval trainings, ram them?
Yeah, certainly key. Look, if you're time starved, don't worry about accumulation of hours, hit high intensity. But we can't, from a musculoskeletal standpoint and a hormonal level, we can't do high intensity every day. And so I think you have a couple of times a week that you're going to go, even if you're just a fitness enthusiast, very high intensity training is good for you. You also want to have strength training. And strength training doesn't need to dominate your life, but 20 to 30 minutes, if you're more endurance focused, is incredibly powerful and a great, what I would call critical supplement. If you're more strength inclined, then it could become a bit more institutional, but strength training. And then supporting sessions are lower stress, but they still have variance in them. Another magic word of performance is variance. So we always want to have, whenever you're doing a thing that's just steady state, in England we call it milk toast. It's just, so always looking at some kind of variance would be the key.
Thanks for those insights on training, but you also have other pillars that you highlight, hydration, fueling, rest. Anything that you could share regarding that? Yeah,
if we nail our recipe of strength and endurance, as an athlete, my mindset, or a fitness enthusiast, is you are less than 50% of the way there to your solution. And so you have two other big pillars you have to think about without becoming a monk or obsessive, and now without falling for fad diets. So under the pillar of nutrition, you can break it down into three key elements. The first is your fueling, the second is your nutrition, your daily eating habits, and the third is your hydration. So I'll do a quick and dirty on them. Fueling. Exercising 60 minutes or less, you don't need to take in calories. No matter what Gatorade tell you, you don't need to take in calories. Okay, under 60 minutes or less. What you do have to do is, if exercise is really long or really intense and a little bit longer, then sugar is your friend on that component because it helps performance during. But the non-negotiable, whether you're taking calories during the workout or not, the non-negotiable, every single time you exercise, you have to consume calories following a workout. And as much as possible, it should be real food. So you want to have protein, because that's going to bring down cortisol and it's going to kickstart your recovery process. You want to have some carbohydrate, because that's going to restore your energy packets. And especially if you exercise in the morning, that's going to actually facilitate your recovery as well. And you want to do it as quickly as we possibly can after the workout, because if we do that, it's going to avoid that athletic starvation that we talked about. It's going to set up better eating habits in the rest of your day, and it's going to elicit your best chance to yield adaptations and consistency over your training or your exercise, as well as your recovery from that exercise. So it becomes, I would say, the number one performance habit, even for just fitness enthusiasts, consuming calories immediately following. If you do that well, and only if you do that well, so if you don't do it, you are failing, period. If you take one thing from today, consume calories following exercise. If you do that well, and then in the rest of your daily eating habits, sugar is not your friend. Okay, sugar we know has a precursor to diabetes, one of the big causes for increasing obesity rates in Western countries. And unfortunately, to put it in another way, if you eat sugar when your metabolic rate is low in the rest of the day, it's going to go straight to your hips. Okay, so reduce or eliminate sugar. You don't need, if we're fueled well, too many starchy carbohydrates, and instead we lean into a platform of health. So it's very simple: nutrient-dense foods, lots of proteins, lots of good fats, and too many vegetables that are very colourful that you've never imagined that you even existed as vegetables. Eat as many of as you can. So that's the nutrition. And then finally, hydration. That's your energy juice. Okay, that is your energy juice. High hydration throughout the day. Ignore hydration during exercise. That's valuable and good. But when you're sitting here at Google, daily hydration will have a huge impact on your energy levels and sustainable energy levels in the day. And when you're sitting here and you're working, if you're starting to feel sleepy or hungry, it's either because you're athletically starved or more typically because you're dehydrated. And of course, the kickback that I get when I say this is, yes, but I have to always go for a pee and it disrupts my work. Okay, yeah, you need to shift the lens on what that is, because that's a performance break. Sitting is the new smoking, yeah? There is lots of research to show that we perform our best work when we actually work in 45 to 75 minutes of great focus. So if you're peeing every hour, that's a chance to move your body, which is better for your longevity and your health. You're going to have better decision making and focus because you're not in a slump. You move your body and you get to pee, so you get to be social. You get to actually talk to people in the bathroom. What more can you dream of? But I think shifting the lens is really, really important. And then there was one more pillar, yeah?
Rest.
Recovery, yeah. Should I talk about that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Let me give you the quick and dirty, because recovery is a trendy sort of subject for athletes. And all of you guys here have sort of probably read about or participate in meditation and components like that, which are part of the recovery process. So when I think about recovery, if you're an athlete, there are basically three main buckets of recovery that we have to consider. That's sport-specific, so if you're an athlete, that's how you're structuring blocks of rest into your season and breaks from the sport, how you're integrating easier days of training into any block of work, and maybe sometimes actually having a complete day off of rest. So there's sport-specific, which most athletes say, that's my recovery. But there are two other key subjects we have to consider, what we call lifestyle and modalities. So your lifestyle is your sleep, your number one recovery tool. You are only going to hear more and more about sleep over the coming years. It is incredibly powerful. And there are lots of research. In fact, just this week, the Harvard Business Review came out with a interesting research-based article on very high-end executives prioritizing sleep relative to mid-managerial type executives. But sleep is a huge component, both in terms of not just your quantity, but your quality of sleep. So that is a powerful recovery tool that cannot be compromised for longevity of high performance, sporting or otherwise. Then there is actually nutrition. And a platform of daily eating facilitates recovery, and as we talked about earlier, your fueling. And then the final two, I think you can co-join, which is your naps and meditation. And if you haven't heard about it yet, you should or you will, but there is no doubt that while it used to be viewed as hippy-dippy, meditation is an important component of recovery and global performance. And that doesn't mean that you have to sit in lotus position and meditate. For many people, that's just finding a quiet space for 7 to 15 minutes a day, often in the middle of the day, and being quiet. And you might fall asleep, hence the nap, and you stimulate growth hormone and other positive effects. And it has a huge impact on your productivity in the afternoon, and research shows it. So you are allowed to be a sloth in the middle of the day for 10 minutes. And that might be listening to Headspace or one of those apps, or it might just be getting into a quiet place or even going for a walk without your screens and grounding yourself, and it's really powerful. So that's the second component of recovery. And then the final is modalities. So modalities is everything that they sell you. Massage, compression socks, cryotherapy and other trendy things like that, heat treatments, foam roller, everything there. And that's another part of recovery. So those are the big sort of families we think about.
Yeah. I think my favorite is definitely the napping.
Yeah.
I try to get that in, and luckily at Google we have some really nice nap pods, so if you're not using those, I recommend that you do. But which would you say is the most important among those?
The ones that we're pushed the most and all the marketing drives us to is framed in the mindset of shortcut. So wear compression socks, go to the local place and get cryotherapy, make sure you have body work done, and all of that stuff is good, the modalities, but it is down there, absolutely down there in importance. If you don't get an appropriate training program with enough recovery integrated into it, again, training, even if you're a fitness enthusiast, not exercise. Exercise is random, training is targeted. So your training, and if you're a fitness enthusiast, appropriate program for you, that's number one, and supported with enough sleep, and I would say proper fueling and nutrition. That is the most important thing. If we can get that, we call it nailing the basics. And our mantra for our pro squad, you would imagine that it's all about equipment and wind tunnels and aerodynamics. Our mantra is nailing the basics. Get those things right. If you get those things right, so an appropriate training program and applied consistently, supported with proper nutrition and enough sleep, you are, and this is thoughtful when I say this, 95% of the way there. Everything else is fluff, incremental. So when you think about it, it's always based in those very basic habits. And it's not about being a monk. It's not about falling for fad diets. It's really about trying to institute very basic habits. And that's the nice thing, is a shift in mindset to say a bit of I'm going old school in a positive way, because I'm just going to build myself up with very foundational habits globally.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I do realize that we're sort of running out of time, and I want to keep plenty of time for the Q&A. You did just launch a book, so maybe we could switch gears there and just talk about that for a little bit. Would you say that that's geared towards the obsessed triathlete?
It's trying to break the obsession of triathletes. So it is a book about triathlon, and it's specifically designed. This is not for my very elite amateur with lots of time in the world, or my professional athletes that are looking to achieve world-class performance. This is about high performance in my sport, triathlon, but extended into really what we talked about today. So how can you draw from this? So I actually think, in fact, I've had a couple of very elite running coaches and a cycling coach ask for this book and read it, not to understand how we train for triathlons, but how to actually integrate the supporting habits to help them help their athletes. And so I think it's really designed specifically for endurance-focused people that are time-starved, that are looking for the very utopian outcome of thriving in, yes, my sport, and in our case, in this book, triathlon, but also in those other institutions that we talked about, which is work, life, and health. And so I don't want to say I'm going to be writing another book because I haven't been asked yet, but the next book would probably be taking this and making it more global and saying, hey, it's about performance in life and whatever your sport is, but this one's certainly for triathletes.
Yeah, I've read it and I really love it. I think you give some great case studies and inspirational examples of people that you've worked with and seen them succeed. And yeah, your writing style is just like you, very serious but with a wink. So yeah, thank you. Maybe one last question. You've worked with a wide variety of athletes. What would you say you're most proud of?
I think as a coach that gets to coach elite athletes, it's very hard to sort of look beyond when one of our athletes was second at the Hawaii Ironman as a professional, and that was a real breakout moment for us back in 2009, and then in 2016 when Tim Reed, an Australian, one of our athletes, won the World Championships, the Half Ironman World Championships. That's obviously great, and a part of what I live for in many ways. You know, that's a great thing. And having Laura win this last weekend, and it's such a historic race. She's the first British athlete, male or female, to ever win Ironman New Zealand. So that's great. But in all honesty, it's a couple of athletes spring to mind. One athlete that came to me who couldn't walk up a flight of stairs and had chronic fatigue so badly, she'd actually lost her daughter in a car crash and went through a terrible place, put on 100 pounds, and 3 years later has now finished a half Ironman, and her whole life has turned around. She's 100 pounds lighter, and that for me is the application of our methodology in a very different way. And then some of the inspirational people that I've got to work with, the sort of captains of industry that are ultimately thriving in the workplace, but I would say certainly not thriving in the rest of their life, not very healthy, and being able to turn it around and enable them to not only improve as an extremely time-starved individual, but also have it bring and spawn into their life. So it's, for me, the pride component comes with seeing people thrive more than actually saying, well, I coached a world champion, which is nice, but it's not why we live, you know. So it's only triathlon, it's only that big. The world is this big. So.
Wonderful, thanks Matt. I'd like to open up to the floor now for some Q&A.
Oh, we have a microphone.
And again, for those joining through live stream, I'll be looking at the dory for you to submit some questions there.
Well, I just want to thank you because you're a tri coach, obviously very accomplished tri coach, and we've talked about triathlons for an hour, and you haven't mentioned VO2 max or lactate testing, which I feel like are usually the first two things out of tri coaches' mouths. So I haven't read the book, but I want to, and I love your approach to it. I'd just love to know the legacy ways of training for Ironman races, which include lactate testing and VO2 max and periodization, stuff like that. Does your method still call for a lot of that? Is it putting that in perspective? Or is it really more just about personalized plans and finding what's right for folks like us, the time-starved athletes?
I call it paralysis of analysis, like the metrics obsessed, and it's all about focusing on the wrong thing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Bear in mind that I'm an exercise physiologist. So, you know, I've probably done 1,000 blood lactate tests and too many VO2 tests and everything along those lines. But there is a lot of that magic word periodization that we hear. So let's think about applying periodization. So in the winter months, you want to build your base. You want to get really fit and you want to become a better butter burner. So you want to do a lot of low intensity training, and yet nearly everyone in the winter months, the days are short and it's freezing cold and you're stuck inside. It doesn't fit life, firstly, so it's upside down. And on top of that, if you are a triathlete, you're going to accumulate naturally all of your riding and running miles, the longer stuff outside when the weather's nice. So, and it's an endurance sport. So the puzzle when applied to everyday people is completely upside down. But with things like VO2 max and those assessments and metrics, data is a great thing. It's good to capture data. It's good to utilize it sometimes on the fly and certainly as an objective review, but you cannot be shackled by data. Because what has happened with the advent of monitoring is people lose the inner animal and sense of self. And so even when we're prescribing, we prescribe intensity by the intention, what it should feel like, what the perceived effort should be, and as a byproduct or an alignment of that, this is about your power or pace or heart rate. So it's at the other end of the equation again. So none of it is bad, it's an understanding of physiology, but I much prefer boiling complex to simple rather than run it. You know, I can impress everyone with long terms, but that doesn't actually, it doesn't resonate. It's not real world. And so let's bring it down to really approachable and basic habits to make people successful. In fact, my race plan for Tim Reed, who won the World Championship, was go and have fun. Because he was an athlete that was so, you would think it was so granular, but he gets very nervous before races. And it was a bit more than go and have fun, but he was so prepared and he knew so much what to do and how to feel that I wanted to release him to just make smart decisions on the day. And the World Championships was in Australia, and it was in his hometown. So I just said, that will never happen again, to have a World Championships in your hometown. So don't let the moment bypass you. Go and have fun, there's that phrase. And what that did was that gave him permission to just relax and go and race at the pure sense. I never talked to him about what power to hold or pace. His body was trained to do that. And he did run pretty fast. He didn't need me to tell him to run fast. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I have one question here on the dory from Johan in Mountain View. He's actually a really good triathlete, I know him. What kind of impact have you seen from people integrating nutrition, sleep, etc., correctly in their training programs? Is it a decrease in time from, let's say, a 9-hour 10 Ironman to 9 hours? Or have you seen even bigger changes?
No, well, I'll give you a professional athlete that was, I coached a woman that when she came to me had already done 20 Ironman races and her fastest time was 11 and a half hours. And by creating more specificity in her training, this is an extreme example, but most importantly shifting nutrition and making her sleep, she went to going under 9 hours. So that's when you start to get pretty fast, by the way. If you're a female athlete going under 9 hours, you're pretty good. And went on to win, I think, 8 or 9 professional Ironman wins. It is seismic and it's everything. And so the results vary, but what ends up, because it's not just about how fast you're going, it's the bigger picture as well. Injuries and interruptions to training and sustainability and enjoyment of the sport and people not or exiting the sport are also equally, I think, really important.
Right.
Yeah.
I think just a live example myself, since adopting this methodology, I knocked off 30 minutes from my Ironman time.
Yeah.
So it's really, nailing the basics, I think, is really important.
Without certainly training more.
No.
With in fact training probably less hours.
No, I've probably been asking for more hours than you've been giving me. So, cool. Any more questions from the room? Yeah. Can we get the mic?
I will give you one tip before I finish as well. Okay, I'll give everyone one tip that I think is important on energy management that will help. But go ahead.
You mentioned longevity and sustainability. I moved up an age bracket this year. So have you noticed anything in the people you coach maybe that shift the pillars? Like, I understand the pillars, I love the pillars, but any like shifting in terms of sustainability or people who are just moving up an age bracket?
Just because you've burst into your 30s doesn't mean that things change. Yeah, as you do get older, the way that you train shifts a little bit, and so there has to be an ever-increasing emphasis on recovery. And one of the things that starts to drop or become suppressed is strength and mobility. So we just make that, it's almost turning up the emphasis on those two components a little bit, and then just being a little careful with how frequently you're hitting intensity. But in the sport of triathlon specifically, when you're hitting, in fact, the fastest age group as an amateur is typically 40 to 45. So, which is bad news for you in some ways. It's only going to get faster. But Yeah, that's your group. But yeah, we have athletes consistently getting faster and faster and faster into their 50s. It's not till about 53, 54 that you start to, and it's obviously not just chronological age, it's biological expression of it, but that's where things just start to drop off a little bit. But it also depends on how long you've been in the sport. So if you've been doing the sport for 15 years, you have to make a radical shift. If you're 2 years in, you can probably just treat yourself like a 30-year-old in many ways, apart from not compromising sleep. Is a really key component.
Cool, thanks, Matt. We are at time, actually.
Yeah.
I know you had one last little tip, if you want to throw that out there.
I'll give you the one very quick and dirty, because it's something that I often have with people that are time-starved and working, which is the afternoon energy slumps. So this has nothing to do with triathlon. But for you guys still in the room or watching live, this is something that I think is worthy of understanding. So who has afternoon energy slumps sometimes? That's 3 o'clock. So the thing that people reach for is either, many people, Monster or Red Bull or Coke or coffee. Yeah. So that's not the thing that's actually going to create the result. What is actually happening there? So as soon as you understand the physiology, it's a breakthrough for you. You have your circadian rhythm, everyone understands that. When you go to bed at night, your body actually slows down and it cools, and that's really restorative. Well, the Spanish had it right with their siestas, because in the afternoon we have a natural circadian rhythm where your body starts to cool a little bit, and it starts to go into a restorative phase. So your core temperature is dropping, and a byproduct of that is sleepiness. So you start to get tired. So what you want is, you don't want to ingest caffeine there that might disrupt sleep and hence start the vicious cycle. All you need is hot liquid. So if you just have hot water with lemon or mint tea or even chamomile tea that you identify with relaxation, something that's hot, it's going to raise your core temperature and it will improve your alertness for the next multiple hours without interrupting sleep. So that's my last tip, because if you go and do that, when you feel tired tomorrow, go and have mint tea and you're like, hang on, that actually works. And I didn't have sugar, that's a short-term spike, and I didn't have caffeine that's going to interrupt sleep later. It's just hot liquid. So for you guys that have to perform in the workplace, that's often maybe a nice way to finish.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, guys.